there is a particular kind of morning that you only recognize in hindsight. The kind of morning where the light comes through the kitchen window at exactly the right angle, and the coffee smells just a little richer than usual, and the person you love most in this world is sitting across from you, newspaper folded in his lap, reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose, and he is humming, just barely humming, something that isn't quite a song, just a low, contented sound. The sound a person makes when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. I didn't know that was the last ordinary morning. I want to tell you something before I begin this story properly. Something that took me years, many years, to understand. Loss does not announce itself. It does not give you a chance to prepare. It does not send you a letter in the mail or knock on your door and say, "Excuse me, I'll be arriving on Tuesday. You might want to put your affairs in order." No, loss comes the way the worst storms come. On a perfectly clear day, when you are standing in your garden, barefoot, admiring the roses you planted together in the spring, when you are laughing at something silly on the television, when you are absolutely, completely, dangerously sure that everything is fine. My name is Aliner, and I am 70 years old, and I have survived things that once upon a time I was not entirely sure I could survive. And I am here. I am still here, sitting in the kitchen of the same house where I have lived for 43 years, in Portland, Oregon, with a cup of tea at my elbow, and the November rain tapping against the window glass. And I want to tell you everything, not because it will be easy, but because I spent too many years believing that if I didn't speak the grief out loud, I could contain it. Keep it small. Keep it manageable. Put it in a box on a shelf in the back of my heart, and only take it down when I was alone and strong enough to look at it. That strategy, I can tell you now, does not work. So, let me start at the beginning. Or rather, let me start at the end of the beginning. The day my ordinary life ended, and something else, something I didn't yet have a word for, began. It was a Tuesday in October, 19 years ago now, the year 2005. James and I had been married for 31 years. 31 years. When people say that number back to me, sometimes they say it the way you say a number that doesn't quite fit in your mouth. 31 years. It sounds like a very long time, doesn't it? And it was. But it also felt, from the inside of it, like it had gone by in the space between two breaths. We met in 1973. I was 24 years old, and I was working as a librarian. Well, I was an assistant at the Multnomah County Library, to be precise, and I was not yet 24. I was 23 years, 8 months, and 14 days old, which matters only because James always said it mattered, because he believed the specific details of things were what made them true. He came in on a Wednesday afternoon looking for a book on the migratory patterns of Pacific salmon. That was what he said. I'm looking for information on the migratory patterns of Pacific salmon. As if this were a perfectly normal thing to say to a woman you had never met. As if he were entirely comfortable saying it. He had brown eyes, warm, slightly startled brown eyes. The way a deer's eyes look when it pauses at the edge of the trees and looks at you and hasn't yet decided whether to run. I found him the book. 3 books, actually. And then I made the mistake, or the gift, depending on how you look at it, of asking him why he wanted to know about salmon. He said he was writing a poem. A poem. This large, slightly awkward man in a green flannel shirt, who worked as a civil engineer for the city and spent his weekends fishing on the Clackamas River, was writing a poem about salmon. I fell in love with him in that moment, though I didn't know it yet. I only knew it was a good answer. I only knew that I wanted to hear more good answers. We had our first date 3 weeks later. We walked along the waterfront and ate fish and chips from a paper bag and talked until the sun went down, and then kept talking in the dark. By the end of that first year, I knew I was going to marry him. By the end of the second year, I had. And for the next 31 years, James Whitfield was the central fact of my life. Not in a suffocating way. Not in the way that some people mean when they say someone is everything to them, as though they have no self of their own. I had my library. I had my garden. I had my friendships, and my book club, and my Tuesday morning walks with my sister Dorothy. James had his engineering, and his river, and his poems. He never stopped writing them, never tried to publish them, just wrote them in a yellow legal pad, and tucked them into the drawer of his nightstand. But he was the gravity at the center of my world. Everything else orbited him. Everything else made more sense because of him. And then one October morning, when the light came through the kitchen window, and the coffee smelled rich, and he sat across from me, humming something that wasn't quite a song. And then the morning ended, and he put down the newspaper, and he said, "Elle, I think I need to go to the doctor." He said it very quietly, offhandedly almost, the way you might say, "I think we're out of milk," ordinary, not alarming, just a fact that needed attending to. But James never said he needed to go to the doctor. In 31 years, James had been to the doctor perhaps 6 times. He was the kind of man who walked off pain, who said it'll pass, about everything from a bad cold to a sprained ankle, who believed that the body, given enough time and enough river walks, could fix most things. So when he said, quietly, on that October Tuesday, that he thought he needed to go to the doctor, I put down my coffee cup very carefully, and I looked at him across the table, and I said, "How long have you been feeling something?" he said. "A little while." A little while for James meant months. I want to tell you something about the period between the moment someone says, "I need to go to the doctor," and the moment you sit in a white room, and a doctor with kind eyes and careful hands explains to you what is happening inside the body of the person you love. I want to tell you that that period is its own kind of grief, a preemptive grief, an anticipatory grief. You don't know yet what you're grieving. You don't know the shape of it yet, but your body knows. Your body starts doing the math before your mind will let itself. You start sleeping lighter. You start watching him differently, not intrusively, not in a way that would worry him, but with a new sharpness, a new attention. The way you look at a painting you know you might not see again. 3 weeks after that Tuesday morning, a doctor named Dr. Priya Anand sat across from James and me in her office in the oncology wing of Providence Hospital, and she explained to us in careful, honest, humane language that James had pancreatic cancer, that it was advanced, that there were options, there were always options, but that she wanted us to understand the realistic picture. The realistic picture. I remember those words. I remember thinking, the realistic picture. As though there might be an unrealistic picture I could choose instead. As though I could purchase a different version of this moment. Take it home, hang it on the wall, and it would show me something different. I held James's hand under the table. I held it the way you hold the railing on a ship in a storm. He held mine back the same way. We did not look at each other. We looked at Dr. Anand, and we asked our questions, and she answered them, and we thanked her, which seems strange now. We thanked her, and then we walked out of the hospital into the October air, and we stood on the sidewalk, and James looked up at the sky. It was gray, that Portland gray that looks like silver if you're feeling generous, like ash if you're not, and he said, "Well, okay then." That was James. That was exactly James. Not denial, not rage, not this can't be right, or we'll get a second opinion. Just okay. Just an acceptance of what was true. Just this is the ground beneath us now, and we will walk on it. I did not feel the same way. Not yet. Not for a long time. We tried. I want you to know that. We tried everything that could be tried in a way that was consistent with James's values and his body and his understanding of what a good life meant. We did chemotherapy. 4 rounds. James bore it with the same quiet stubbornness with which he bore most things, getting up when he felt well enough to get up, lying still when he didn't, never complaining in a way that was designed to elicit pity. He said once, about halfway through the 2nd round, when he was lying on the couch with a cold cloth over his eyes, and I was sitting in the armchair beside him, reading aloud from a novel we'd always meant to read together, he said, "This isn't the worst thing I can imagine." I said, "What would be the worst thing?" He said, "Losing you first." I didn't answer. I kept reading. But I had to stop for a moment and look at the page without seeing it, and breathe through something that wasn't quite air, and then find my place again. The chemotherapy slowed things. It did not stop them. by the spring of 2006, 7 months after the diagnosis, Dr. Anand sat with us again and explained in the same careful, honest language that the treatment was no longer doing enough to justify what it was costing James, that continuing it would likely reduce the quality of the time he had rather than meaningfully extend it. James said, "How long?" She said she couldn't say with certainty. She said, and she said this gently, with the particular gentleness of a person who has had this conversation many times and has not become callous to it. She said that if he stopped treatment, it might be weeks, it might be a few months. Bodies are individual. Life is not predictable. But we should, she said, begin making plans that honored the time he had. We drove home in silence, not uncomfortable silence, not the silence of two people who don't know what to say to each other. The silence of two people who know each other well enough to know that some things don't need to be said yet, that the saying of them can wait until we are home, in our kitchen, with the familiar ceiling above us and the familiar smell of the house around us. When we got inside, James went straight to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and made tea, 2 cups, as he always did. And then he set mine in front of me and sat down across from me, and he said, "I want to talk about what comes next. Not what comes next for me. I have some thoughts about that, and I'll tell you. But I want to talk about what comes next for you. After." I told him I didn't want to talk about that. He said, "I know, but I'm asking you to do it anyway." That conversation, that kitchen conversation in April 2006, with the rain on the window, and the tea growing cold and James's hands flat on the table between us. That was one of the hardest conversations of my life, and also, I understand now, one of the most generous things he ever did for me. He asked me to promise him things. He asked me to promise that I would keep the garden, not because he cared that much about the garden. He didn't. That was always mine. But because he knew that I would be tempted to let things go, to let myself go, to turn the garden into a monument to grief rather than a thing that was alive and needed tending. He asked me to promise that I would not stop reading aloud. He said he hoped I would find someone to read aloud to someday. A grandchild, a friend, a stranger. Just don't stop, he said. Your voice is a good thing. Don't let it go silent. He asked me to promise that I would eventually, not right away, not for a long time, but eventually, find out what came next for me. That I would not make of his absence a wall I hid behind. That I would keep walking forward, even when forward felt wrong. I promised. I made the promises because he asked. I did not fully believe I would be able to keep them. I did not fully believe, sitting across from my husband in our kitchen in the rain, that there was going to be a what comes next for me. I believed, in that moment, in a way that was real and not performative, that when James went, a version of me would go with him. And I was right about that. That version did go. I just didn't know yet that what came after it would be a version of me I hadn't met yet. James died on the 17th of August, 2006. He died at home. That was his choice, and we honored it. My daughter Claire had come from Seattle. James's brother Robert drove down from Washington. My sister Dorothy came. Of course Dorothy came. Our neighbor of 20 years, Harriet, sat in the living room downstairs because she said she didn't want us to be alone in the house, even if we didn't need her. And she was right. We didn't need her exactly, but we needed to know she was there. James spent his last few days in our room, in our bed, with the window open because he always wanted fresh air, even when it was a little too cold. He slept a great deal. When he was awake, he was peaceful isn't exactly the word, because peaceful sounds passive, and James was never passive. He was present. He was very, very present. He looked at things carefully. At me, at Claire, at the ceiling, at the light coming through the window. On his last clear afternoon, he asked me to read to him. I read to him from the nature writing of Annie Dillard, a passage from Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, about starlings, about the way thousands of starlings move in murmuration. That extraordinary flowing of birds through the sky as though they are one organism, one mind, one piece of dark silk thrown against the gray. He fell asleep while I was reading. When I looked up from the page, his eyes were closed and his breathing was changed. Not frightening, slower, quieter, like a tide going out. I kept reading. I read to him for 3 more hours. I read about starlings and about creek water and about light. I read past the chapter I had been reading. I kept going because stopping felt like acknowledging something I was not ready to acknowledge. At 8:47 in the evening, on the 17th of August, with the window open and the curtain moving in the warm night air, and the sound of a neighbor's dog somewhere down the street, James's breathing changed one last time and then stopped. I sat with him for a while. Then I closed the book, put it on the nightstand beside his glasses and his reading light and his yellow legal pad, which had a poem half finished on it, the last poem he had written, about the river, about a heron standing still in the shallows for so long it became part of the water. Then I went downstairs and told my daughter that her father had gone. I want to describe grief accurately, because I think it is often described inaccurately, and the inaccuracy makes it harder for people who are living through it. Grief is described as a storm, as something that crashes over you in waves, as something that moves in stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, as though it follows a tidy progression like a school curriculum. And if you just get through the chapters, you'll graduate on the other side. That is not what grief is. Or rather, it is that sometimes, in moments. But it is also so much more than that. It is also, and perhaps primarily, the most profound mundanity you have ever experienced. Grief is opening the refrigerator and seeing the ginger ale he kept there for his stomach. Grief is getting 2 coffee cups out of the cupboard by habit, and then standing there with 2 cups in your hands, just standing there. Grief is the specific angle of a Tuesday afternoon in October, when the light is the same as it was then, on the last ordinary morning, and your body responds to the light before your mind can catch up. Grief is the silence, not a dramatic silence, not a thunderous, oceanic silence, a small silence, the absence of someone humming in the next room, the absence of boots by the door, the absence of a car in the driveway that used to make a small specific sound when it turned in off the street, a little mechanical cough, a characteristic sound that you never even consciously noticed until it was gone. And then you noticed its absence every single day. The first month after James died, I was not truly alone. Claire stayed for 2 weeks. Dorothy came every few days. Friends brought food, so much food. All the food that people bring when they don't know what else to bring. And I ate none of it, and gave most of it away, and was grateful anyway. Dr. Annan's office called to check on me, which surprised me and moved me deeply. Harriet from next door left things on my porch. Sometimes food, sometimes a bunch of flowers from her garden, once a small book of Emily Dickinson poems with no note, just the book. But people have their own lives. They have their own grief, because everyone who loved James was grieving too, and my grief was not more important than theirs, only different, only closer. And slowly, the way these things go, the visits became less frequent. The calls became shorter, and I found myself 2 months after James's death, in October, the cruelest of months, that October, truly alone in the house. And I learned something about myself in that time that I did not entirely like. I learned that I was a person who, when faced with profound pain, had a strong and persistent tendency to make myself useful. Useful, as though if I was doing something, accomplishing something, ticking things off a list, the grief couldn't quite get its hands on me. I cleaned the house. I organized 40 years of photographs. I sorted James's office, his engineering books, his papers, his yellow legal pads, 12 of them, I counted, full of poems in his angular handwriting. I weeded the garden. I raked every leaf. I recaulked the bathroom tiles. And when I ran out of things to do, I found more things to do. My therapist. I should mention here that I eventually, after considerable resistance, began seeing a therapist named Dr. Kate Morrison, who operated out of a small office near Hawthorne with a very good lamp and a bowl of mints on her coffee table. My therapist called this activity as avoidance. She said it gently. She said, "Aliner, there is nothing wrong with being useful, but I wonder if all this activity is a way of staying one step ahead of something. I said, "What do you think I'm staying ahead of?" She said, "The grief." I said, "But I'm grieving." "I know I'm grieving." She said, "Knowing you're grieving and letting yourself grieve are different things." I thought about that for the entire drive home. I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes thinking about it. Because she was right, and I knew she was right, and I also very much did not want her to be right. Because here is the thing about letting yourself grieve. It is not graceful. It is not the kind of grief you see in movies. The single tear down the perfect cheek, the tasteful sob at the appropriate moment, the composed widow in black saying dignified things at the memorial service. It is not controlled. It is not manageable. It is not something that happens in neat intervals and then stops. Real grief, when you let it in, is an ambush. It is completely undignified. It happens in the grocery store when you see his brand of cereal. It happens in the middle of a telephone conversation with your daughter about something mundane. It happens at 3 a.m. when you wake up reaching for someone who isn't there, and your hand finds only the cold flatness of an empty pillow and something inside you that you have been keeping very carefully sealed tears open. It happened to me in the garden, 3 months after James died. It was January, cold. I had gone outside for no particular reason, just restlessness, just the need to be in the open air. And I was standing by the bare rose bushes, the roses we had planted together in our first spring in this house. And I thought about how I had to prune them soon. I thought about how James used to watch me prune them. He never gardened himself, never had the patience for it, but he liked to watch me. He said it looked like I was having a conversation with them. And I thought about how this spring, when they bloomed, he would not see them. And that was it. That was all it took. I sat down in the wet January garden and I grieved, not decorously, not quietly. I grieved the way you grieve when you have held it in for 3 months, and the container finally breaks. I sat in the cold mud among the bare roses, and I cried until I couldn't breathe. And I talked. I actually spoke out loud to James. I told him I was angry. I told him it wasn't enough time. I told him I didn't know how to do this. I told him I was afraid. I told him I missed him in a way that was not abstract or poetic, but physical. A physical ache, like a wound in the center of my chest, like something that should be there wasn't. I stayed out there for a long time. When I finally came back inside, I was wet and cold, and my knees ached, and I had mud on my coat. I made tea. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I noticed, for the first time in 3 months, a strange thing. I felt a little lighter, not better, not healed, not in any way past anything. Just a little bit of pressure had been released, like the difference between a room that is too sealed and one with a single window cracked open. Just a little air. I called Dr. Morrison that evening and I said, I think you were right. She said she was glad to hear it. Healing, real healing, not the performance of healing, not the story we tell people when they ask how we're doing, and we say, better, thank you, really. Bit by bit, real healing is not a line you walk from darkness to light. It is not progressive in the way that word usually means. It is more like, and I am going to try to get this right, because it matters. It is more like weather. Some days are better. The sun comes out and you think, I am going to be all right. You do something ordinary. You read a good book. You have lunch with Dorothy. You spend an afternoon in the garden, and the tulips are coming up, and the world is genuinely, undeniably lovely, and you think, yes, this is still worth it. I am still in it. I can keep going. And then there are other days. Days when the weight of it comes back with all the force of a new thing, not diminished, not softened, just returned. Full and undiminished. And you stand in your kitchen holding 2 coffee cups again, and you set one down very carefully, and you tell yourself, this is still grief. This is still part of it. This is not a step backward. It is just Tuesday. Dr. Morrison helped me understand something crucial in those first 2 years. She said grief is not linear, but it does, over time, change in quality. The grief of the first year, she said, is about presence and absence, the visceral, daily, moment-to-moment experience of a world that has been reorganized around an absence. You wake every morning into the new configuration. Everything has to be renegotiated. Routines, identities, the answer to the question, how are you? The answer to the question, who are you? Because James's death did not only take James. It took 31 years of accumulated identity. It took the version of Alina, who was James's wife. It took the particular way I understood myself through him. Not in a subsuming, unhealthy way, just in the ordinary way that sharing a life with someone becomes part of how you narrate your own life. My husband and I prefer gone. James always says gone. We usually gone. Every pronoun is a small death. In the second year, 2007, I started doing something that I had not planned and did not entirely understand at first. I started writing. Not a journal, exactly. Not a diary. Something between the two. I would sit at the kitchen table in the morning with my tea, and I would write about James, yes, but also about myself. About what I was thinking and feeling and noticing. About the garden. About what I was reading. About conversations I'd had with Claire, with Dorothy, with Dr. Morrison. About memories, specific memories, the kind that arrive without warning and stay long enough to be examined. I wrote about the first time I ever saw James laugh. We were at a party, a dull party, the kind you go to because someone you like has invited you and you don't want to be rude. And someone told a joke and James laughed, and the laugh was completely unexpected. It was big and helpless and completely unembarrassed, like a child laughing. like someone who had never learned to modulate laughter for social consumption. And I thought, there it is. That's the real one. I wrote about that, and about other things, the specific weight of his hand, the way he walked slightly ahead on sidewalks, not because he was inconsiderate, but because he was always slightly more interested in where he was going than in slowing down. The salmon poem. I never did read the salmon poem that he wrote in 1973, the one that sent him to the library. I always meant to ask him if he'd kept it. I never did. The writing did something I had not expected. It organized the grief, not contained it, not minimized it, but gave it a shape. A thing with a shape is a thing you can exist alongside. A thing without a shape is just whether inside you. The writing made it possible to put the grief down sometimes. Just set it on the page and walk away from the desk and do other things, not because the grief was resolved, but because it was held. Dr. Morrison said this was what therapists call externalization, the idea that putting something outside yourself into words, onto paper, allows you to see it with a little more distance, to be the author of your grief rather than simply its subject. I liked that. Author rather than subject. I started a small group that year as well, not intentionally. It grew out of a book club meeting at Dorothy's house, where three of us, quite unexpectedly, found ourselves talking about loss. Not James specifically. One of the other women, Patricia, had lost her sister. Another, Marion, had lost her mother the year before. We were supposed to be talking about an Ian McEwan novel. Instead, we talked for 2 hours with a frankness and depth that none of us had quite managed in the organized condolence visits and carefully managed grief conversations of the months preceding. At the end of the evening, Patricia said, "Can we do this again?" And we did. Every 2 weeks, the three of us, and eventually a fourth woman named Susan, who had been widowed the previous spring, met at someone's house. We brought food. We brought whatever we were reading. And we talked. Not always about loss. Sometimes we talked about books, about our children, about things happening in the world, about recipes and politics, and the general absurdity of getting older. But the loss was always there, available, if someone needed to bring it. It didn't have to be managed. That group, which we never formally named, though Dorothy, who joined us in our 3rd year, called it the undefended room, which we all agreed was exactly right. That group was, I think, one of the most important things that happened to me in the years after James died. Not therapy, not advice, not solutions, just a place where I did not have to be finished with grieving, because here is one of the cruelest things about loss in our culture, in American culture, in the culture I know. And that is, we are given a very small window of permitted grief. People are generous and present and wonderfully kind in the immediate aftermath of loss. The food appears. The calls come. the arms open, and then, gradually, the expectation shifts. Not unkindly, people aren't cruel. They aren't demanding you perform recovery. It's more subtle than that. It's the slight change in expression when, 8 months out, you are still obviously not okay. The still, that hovers unspoken behind, how are you feeling? The gentle implication that perhaps, by now, you should be finding your way back to something more ordinary. James had been the central fact of my life for 31 years. 8 months was not going to be enough. A year was not going to be enough. I needed to grieve on my own timeline, and finding people who understood that, who were on their own odd, nonlinear, inconvenient timelines of grief, was like finding solid ground when I had been wading in something without a bottom. I told you this story was about healing and closure. I want to be honest with you about what that means, because I think those words are used in ways that promise things they don't quite deliver. Closure. People talk about closure the way they talk about a door, as though grief is a room you've been in for too long, and closure is the thing that lets you walk out and pull the door shut behind you and be done. You closed it. It's closed. You are on the other side. That is not what closure is. Or at least, it is not what closure was for me. What I found slowly, painfully, imperfectly, and with many wrong turns, was not a door closing behind me. It was something more like learning to carry weight. Learning that the weight of James's absence was always going to be with me, and that the question was not how to put it down, but how to carry it and still move. In the 3rd year after James died, this is 2008, and I am going to be honest with you about what happened in that year. Even the parts that are uncomfortable to admit. In the 3rd year, something shifted. I started to feel angry, not at James, not exactly at James, though there was some of that. Yes, the irrational fury of the bereaved, the how could you leave me here? How dare you have left me here? That comes in waves, and then passes with shame. Because of course he didn't choose it. Of course, there is no one to be angry at, but angry at the situation, angry at the shape my life had taken, angry at myself, I think, for how completely I had organized my life around another person, so that when that person was gone, I had to rebuild from very nearly nothing. I had a career, yes. I had risen at the library. I had been head librarian at a branch for 15 years, which I was proud of. I had my garden. I had Dorothy and the undefended room. I had Claire, who was a good daughter, who called twice a week and visited when she could, and was careful and loving, and worried about me with a worry she mostly kept to herself, which I appreciated, but who was a leaner Whitfield without James? Not a complete question. I know that now. I know that my identity was always more than his wife, but in that 3rd year, it felt like the right question. It felt urgent and uncomfortable, and worth sitting with, even though sitting with it was not comfortable. I started doing things I hadn't done in a long time. Alone, I went to a concert, a small chamber music concert at Reed College, just by myself, on a Saturday night in March. I hadn't gone to a concert alone since before James. I sat in the third row and listened to a string quartet play Schubert. And I cried a little quietly, not because I was sad, but because the music was beautiful and I was there to receive it. Just me, just a leaner, just this person who could hear beauty and be moved by it, even in the absence of someone to share it with. I started taking classes, a pottery class at the community center. I was terrible at it, which was actually important, because I had been good at things for a long time, had been competent and capable and organized, and there was something necessary and almost funny about being truly, cluelessly bad at something, about throwing something wobbly at a wheel and having it collapse and laughing at myself. I started volunteering. At the library, of course. I had retired by then, and the new librarians were kind about having me around. But also at a hospice volunteer program, which perhaps sounds like an odd choice for a woman who had just lost her husband to terminal illness. And Dr. Morrison raised her eyebrows very slightly when I told her, but I knew why I was doing it. I knew before she asked, because sitting with people in the hard place, the place between the diagnosis and the end, the place I had been with James, was something I now knew how to do. Not fix, not solve, just sit, hold a hand, read aloud if they wanted, be present with someone in a time when presence is the only gift left to give. I did it for 3 years. I sat with 17 people as they died. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds heavy. And it was, sometimes. It was grief's grief, a layering of loss upon loss that required careful management. Dr. Morrison and I spoke often during those years. The undefended room held me through them. But it was also the most meaningful thing I had done in a very long time, because in sitting with those 17 people, I discovered something about grief that I had not been able to access from the inside of my own grief. Every single one of them was afraid of being forgotten, not afraid of dying, not primarily. Some were afraid of pain. Some were afraid for the people they were leaving. But the fear that came up most consistently, the fear that I heard in different forms and different words from nearly every one of them, was this: I don't want to disappear. I don't want to have been here and then be gone as though I was never here. And I understood that fear completely. I had felt it for James. The terror that a person as real and specific and present as James Whitfield could simply not be there anymore. That the specific texture of who he was could evaporate. That his voice, his laugh, the way he walked ahead on the sidewalk, the salmon poem, the yellow legal pads, could become only memory, and then only increasingly vague memory, and then eventually not even that, one of the people I sat with was a man named Frank. Frank was 68 years old, and he had been a high school history teacher in the same school for 32 years. And he was dying of congestive heart failure, and he had 4 children who came as often as they could but couldn't always come. And on the days when they couldn't come, I came. Frank liked to talk about his students, about specific students from specific years. He remembered them with extraordinary clarity. These young people from the 70s and 80s and 90s and early 2000s remembered their names and their qualities and the things they had said and what had happened to some of them later. He had a sense that he had mattered to them, most of them, and that they had mattered to him, and he wanted that acknowledged before he went. I sat with Frank for 6 weeks. On the day he died, I was not there. His daughter was there, which was right and good. But I had spent those 6 weeks listening to him, and I want to tell you, when a person is truly listened to in their last weeks, when someone receives the full reality of who they are and what they have been and takes it seriously, that person is not alone. Even in a hospital room, that person is witnessed. That was what I was doing with James in our last months and days. I understood then. I was witnessing, and the witnessing was a gift in both directions. I have been in this garden for over 40 years. These roses in front of me, some of them are original plants from 1976, when we moved into this house and James, and I planted them together on an April Saturday with sore backs and dirt under our fingernails, and the particular happiness of making something permanent. They are not the same plants they were, of course. They have grown and been pruned back and grown again. They have survived hard winters and good summers, and the year of the severe aphid infestation, and the year that felt too dry. A rose bush is not the same entity from year to year. The material of it changes, the shape of it changes, and yet it is continuous. It is the same rose bush. The fact that it has changed is not a contradiction of its continuity. I learned things about grief from the garden that I could not have learned any other way. I learned that things come back, not the way they were, not unchanged, not exactly as before, but come back. In February, when the garden is at its least promising, when it is bare and seemingly inert, and the ground is cold, and you can see nothing living, the life is still there. It is dormant. It is waiting. And then March comes, and April, and the thing you thought might be gone is not gone. It was only waiting. I don't want to make this sound simple. I don't want to use the garden as a metaphor in a way that makes grief sound like something that just needs a little time and good care, and it'll bloom again. Grief is more complicated and more painful than that, and I refuse to sentimentalize it. But I will say this, tending things kept me. When I pruned the roses in February, I was required to be present in a particular way, attentive, careful, physical. My hands in the cold air, my my body doing a thing that needed doing, the rose responding to what I gave it. There was a reciprocity in the garden that was not demanding in the way human reciprocity can be demanding, but was real, was a genuine exchange. I think about a passage I used to read to James near the end from Annie Dillard, who I still love, where she writes about how nature is the strangest possible thing to look at, that it is always doing something extraordinary if you pay attention closely enough. A spider weaving, light on water, the way a murmuration of starlings moves like a single mind. James went out watching. He went out paying attention. And the garden taught me, you can keep paying attention even when the person you paid attention alongside is gone. The attention does not end with them. The attention is yours. About 4 years after James died, in 2010, I did something that felt monumental, and that, in retrospect, I am grateful for doing. I read the yellow legal pads, all 12 of them. I had kept them on the shelf in his office, in the room I had preserved more or less as he left it, which Dr. Morrison and I had discussed many times, and which she had been careful not to push me on, respecting that I would know when I was ready, and when I needed to do something different with that room. I sat down on a Sunday afternoon with all 12 pads, and I read every poem he had ever written, starting from the earliest, 1972, before I met him, before the library, a young man writing about rivers and mountains, and light with a serious heart and an imperfect pen. I read the poem about the salmon. It was in the second pad, the one he had been writing when he came to the library. It was not a perfect poem. He was 24, and he knew more about engineering than about prosody, but it was a real poem. It was about the way salmon come home, the way they navigate by some force or instinct or memory through thousands of miles of open ocean, back to the specific creek where they were born, to make something and to die. I read it 3 times. I read all the poems through over 3 days. Some made me laugh. Some made me cry. Some surprised me. There was a period in the 1990s where he had been writing poems about our marriage, about our daily life, about small things I had completely forgotten. A particular Sunday morning, a road trip we took, a fight we had, and how we repaired it. He had been watching us, recording us, all this time. In yellow legal pads in the nightstand drawer. At the end of the 3rd day, I sat at his desk. I moved to his desk for the reading, which felt right, and I felt something shift. Not heal, not close, shift, as though I had been carrying something heavy in one particular way for 4 years. And now I had adjusted my grip, and the weight was the same, but the carrying of it was slightly different, slightly more manageable, slightly more mine. I closed the last legal pad and I said, "Thank you," out loud to the room, to him. Thank you for writing it down, for paying attention, for leaving the evidence of yourself in 12 yellow legal pads in a nightstand drawer, for being specific enough and real enough and present enough that 4 years after you are gone, I can sit at your desk and know who you were. Something happened in the 5th year that I had not anticipated and was not entirely prepared for. I started to feel happy sometimes, not at James's expense, not in a way that forgot him or minimized him or tried to move past him as though he were a chapter I was finished with, but genuine, uncomplicated happiness, small happiness, the happiness of a good morning, of a productive hour in the garden, of a particularly good book, of laughter with Dorothy at something neither of us could stop laughing at for a good 10 minutes. And with the happiness came something I had not expected. Guilt. The guilt of the survivor. The guilt of the person who is still here, still receiving pleasure, still laughing, while the person they loved is not. The sense that to be happy is somehow to move away from them, to leave them behind. I brought this to Dr. Morrison. I said I felt guilty about laughing. She said, very simply, "What would James say about that?" And I knew immediately. I knew exactly what James would say. He would say quietly, without judgment, in the pragmatic, loving way he had, he would say, "Elle, that's the most useless thing you could spend your time on." Not unsympathetic, not dismissive, just practical, just, the guilt is not useful. It does not honor me. It does not help you. Set it down. I started in the 5th year to practice something that felt uncomfortable at first and became, gradually, one of the most important habits of my later life. What I came to think of as holding 2 things: the capacity to hold grief and joy simultaneously, to feel James's absence acutely, and to also feel the beauty of an October morning acutely, to carry the weight of what was lost, and to also receive the weight of what was present. It's not a resolution. It's not one replacing the other. It's both, always both. The happiness doesn't make the grief go away. The grief doesn't make the happiness invalid. They exist together, the way. And here I'll borrow the garden again. The way a tree can be growing new leaves in spring and still carry the marks of every winter it has ever survived. The 5th year was also the year I went back to working more seriously. I had been consulting at the library since my retirement, helping with collection development, sometimes doing story hours for children, which I loved fiercely. But in the 5th year, I took on a longer project, writing a history of the Multnomah County library system. A proper historical document, fully researched, drawing on archives and interviews. This sounds like a small, professional thing, but it was not small to me, because it required me to think about legacy, to think about what things last, to think about what institutions are. And they are, I realized, made of the people who inhabited them. Every librarian who ever worked in those buildings, every patron who ever found a book that changed something for them, every person who ever sat in a library chair and disappeared into a story. They are part of the building's history. They are the building's history in a way the bricks and mortar aren't. James is part of my history, not as a closed chapter, but as foundational, as one of the structures that hold everything up. Without those 31 years, I would not be this a leaner. I would not have this particular relationship with patience and with presence and with the specific way light comes through a kitchen window. He is in everything I am, even now, even 19 years later. That's not sadness. That's how love works. I have not talked enough yet about my daughter. Claire was 38 when her father died, which is old enough to not need a father in the logistical sense. She had her own life, her own marriage, her own work as an architect in Seattle. But of course, no one stops needing their father at 38. That is not how it works. Claire and James had a complicated relationship, the way fathers and daughters sometimes do. They were alike in certain ways that made it hard for them to be together easily. Both opinionated, both slow to back down, both, under the strong outer shell, more tender than they liked to show. They had gone through a difficult period when Claire was in her 20s, a period of distance and misunderstanding that is theirs to keep, not mine to tell. But they had come through it. By the time James was diagnosed, they were genuinely close, genuinely good friends even, with the ease that sometimes comes when a parent and child stop trying to be parent and child and become, instead, two people who love each other. So she lost a great deal, and she grieved differently than I did. Harder in some ways, faster, and more fiercely, as though she was trying to compress it. She threw herself into work. She ran marathons. She became, I could see this from a distance, as a mother more tightly controlled, more efficient, less available to things that cost emotional energy. We did not talk about it immediately. There is a particular delicacy in the grief of a mother and child who have both lost the same person. You are each other's closest witness and also each other's most painful mirror. Every time I looked at Claire, I saw James. She has his eyes, that warm, startled brown. And I knew that every time she looked at me, she saw everything she had lost in my face. But about 3 years after James died, we had a conversation. We were sitting on my porch in early evening, a warm June evening, both of us with glasses of wine, watching the garden in the long summer light. Claire was quiet in a way that felt different from her usual quiet, a fuller quiet, a more effortful quiet. And I waited because I have learned the patience of waiting for the right moment. And she said, "Mom, do you still miss him every day?" I said, "Every day." She said, "Does it ever get better?" I said, "It changes. The weight changes. You learn to carry it differently. But the missing, no. The missing doesn't go away." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I don't know how to carry it and still be the person I want to be." And that was the truest thing she had said to me since James died. That was the thing that had been behind all the marathons and the efficiency and the tight control. I said, I don't think it's either or. I think the person you want to be is the person who learns to carry it. She said, How? I said, I'll tell you what I know, and then you'll figure out the rest, because you're different from me, and your grief is different from mine, and that's all right. And I told her about the garden and the January mud, about the yellow legal pads, about Frank and the 17 people, about the undefended room, about holding two things. She cried for a long time on my porch in the June evening. I held her hand, and then I held her. And after a while she said, I miss him so much. And I said, I know, me too. Me too. That evening, that porch evening, was one of the gifts that came from grief. Not in spite of it, not instead of it, because of it. Because loss, when you let it, makes you more available to the people you still have. It makes you less casual about presents. It makes you sit on the porch in June and actually look at the light and actually receive the person beside you. Claire started therapy the following month. She joined a grief support group in Seattle. She trained as a hospice volunteer, completely independently of my having done it, which made me laugh, which made her laugh, which made us both cry, which was exactly the right order of things. We are closer now than we have ever been. She is 49. I am 70. We talk twice a week, and we mean it when we ask how each other is. James is in that too. People asked me, in the years after James died, whether I thought I would ever. And here they would pause, searching for the right word, move on. Whether I thought I would meet someone new. Whether I thought about that. I thought about it. I did not meet anyone, and I am not going to tell you a story about romantic love rekindled, because that is not my story. But I want to address the question seriously, because I think the way we handle it culturally is not always helpful. The framing of moving on is problematic. It implies that to build a new life after loss, you must leave something behind. That new happiness cancels old love. That to open your arms to new possibilities is to close your hands around what was. That's not true. Or at least, it was not true for me. What I found over the years was that James did not shrink to make room for the new things. He stayed exactly the size he was. The love stayed exactly the size it was. And somehow, and this is the paradox that I cannot explain, but that I know to be real, somehow the love for what I had lost made me more capable of love in other directions. Not less. I fell in love in the years after James with things, with my garden more deeply than before, with the hospice work, with the writing, with a friendship I made at 62 with a woman named Vera, who was recently widowed herself, and who became, quickly and improbably, one of the closest friends of my life. With my grandchildren, Claire's son Thomas was born in 2012, and Dorothy's grandson came to visit for summers, and watching small humans discover the world with total astonishment is one of the best available cures for the self-absorption of grief. With mornings, I fell in love with mornings again, not the specific morning I lost, the last ordinary morning, the light and the coffee and the humming, but mornings in general, the capacity of a morning to be completely new. The way the light comes through the window differently every day, depending on the season and the cloud cover and the angle of the sun. I think this is what healing looked like for me. Not recovering what was lost, but slowly, imperfectly, over years, falling back in love with being alive, with the sheer strange fact of consciousness in a world that is constantly, quietly, offering itself to be noticed. James noticed things. That was one of his best qualities. He paid attention. He looked at things carefully and gave them their full weight. He wrote poems about salmon and herons and light on water and the specific way his wife moved through a garden on a Saturday morning. He taught me to pay attention, and when he left, I took the paying attention with me. I kept it. I practice it still. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. I am going to speak now about something people don't often speak about, which is the relationship between grief and your own mortality. The way losing someone close to you, someone your own age, or close to your age, forces you into a different relationship with your own eventual end. James was 61 when he died. I was 57, nearly 58. We had imagined, not in concrete terms, but in the background way that married people imagine, that we would have another 20 years, perhaps, that we would travel, that we would sit on the porch and read and grow old in the slow, unglamorous, deeply comfortable way of people who know each other through and through. We had not examined that expectation. It lived in us quietly, assumed. When James died, the assumption died with him, and what replaced it was something I was not prepared for, an awareness of time that was not morbid or fearful exactly, but sharp, present, the kind of awareness that comes when you realize that time is not in fact infinite, that the days are not in fact countless, that what you do with them is not a trivial question. At 60, I made some choices. I retired fully from the library and gave the consulting work to someone younger who needed it more. I finished the library history, which was published in 2014, and which nobody outside of Oregon read, but which I am enormously proud of. I started this writing more deliberately, with more intention. I started running very slowly in the mornings, which I had never done before in my life, and which I am apparently not finished doing, because here I am at 70, still putting on my shoes at 6 in the morning. At 65, I did something James had asked me to do in that kitchen conversation. I went to see the thing I had always wanted to see. He had known what it was. I had mentioned it only once, in passing, years before, and he had remembered. I went to Scotland. My grandmother was Scottish. Not that I had any family there anymore. It was purely a matter of ancestral memory, of a pull I couldn't exactly explain. I went for 2 weeks, alone, with a rental car and a map, and a list of places that I had gotten from a book, and a list of places that had no reason except instinct. I drove through the Highlands. I walked on Skye in the rain, which is basically the only way to walk on Skye. The rain is included in the experience. The locals understand this. I sat on a cliff top above a sea that was gray and enormous and ancient, and absolutely indifferent to anything I had ever known or lost or wanted. And I thought about James. Of course, I thought about James. I thought about him saying, "Well, okay then," on the sidewalk in October 2005, looking up at the Portland sky. I thought about his handwriting in the yellow legal pads. I thought about him watching me in the garden. And then I thought about something else. I thought about how small my grief was. I thought about how small everything I had ever known or lost or wanted was, relative to that gray, indifferent sea. Not in a nihilistic way, not in the way that says nothing matters because the universe is enormous. In the opposite way, in the way that says, of course it matters, precisely because it is small and particular, and only happens once, and nobody else will ever have exactly this. Exactly this moment, this grief, this specific love, this woman on a cliff top in Scottish rain, and it matters completely. I carried James up that cliff top with me. I carry him everywhere. At 70, which is where I am now, I notice I think about death more than I used to. Not with fear, exactly, with a kind of seriousness, with the recognition that the horizon has always been there, but that I am now close enough to see it more clearly. I notice I have become less interested in things that don't matter, in maintaining surfaces that don't mean anything, in performing wellness or happiness for other people's comfort. I notice I have become more interested in presence, in the specific texture of a good day, in what I actually want to say to the people I love, as opposed to the courteous version of what I want to say. I notice that I think about James differently now than I did in the first year, or the 5th year, or the 10th year. In the first year, raw, searing, immediate, the wound. In the 5th year, organizing, getting shape, learning to carry. In the 10th year, present but softer, a companion rather than an emergency. Now, at 19 years, integrated, woven in, part of the fabric of who I am so completely that I no longer always notice the weaving. He is just here, inside the way I look at things, inside the way I love my daughter, inside the way I sit in this kitchen on a November morning with rain on the window. That is, I think, what healing looks like on the other side of 19 years. Not the absence of grief, the incorporation of it. I want to speak to you now, directly, not as a narrator, not as someone telling a story at a careful distance, but as a woman who has been through something and come out the other side and wants to tell you what she knows. If you are in the early days of loss, I am so sorry. I mean that without any of the automatic quality that those words can take on. I mean it the way I meant it when I said it to Frank's daughter on the day he died. Sitting with her in the hospital corridor while she held his watch in both hands. I mean it the way I would want someone to mean it to me. You are in the hardest part, the most disoriented part, the part where the world has been reorganized, and you haven't yet learned the new layout, where you keep reaching for the thing that isn't there, where the absence of someone is louder than any presence. Here is what I know about that. You are not going to feel this way forever. That is not a promise that it gets easy. It is only a promise that it changes, that the weight changes shape, that your capacity for carrying it grows. That is not comfort, I know. It sounds like saying, it'll be fine eventually. And that's not what I mean. I mean, you are capable of more than you know right now. You will surprise yourself. Probably not today, probably not this week, but at some point you will look back and realize you have come further than you believed possible. Let people help you. This is harder than it sounds. There is a particular pride that grief produces in some of us. The I don't want to be a burden kind of pride. The I should be able to handle this kind. And it is not helpful. It is, in fact, a wall. Let the wall down. Let the food be brought. Let the calls happen. Let someone sit with you in the hard place. You can return the kindness later. You will return it, in fact. Being helped through something hard makes most people more capable of helping, not less. Find your undefended room. Find the people or the place where you don't have to manage your grief, where it doesn't have to be appropriate or scheduled or proportionate, where you can be exactly as unfinished as you are. Be patient with your own nonlinearity. Grief does not move in a straight line. You will have good weeks and then terrible Tuesdays that feel like month one again. This is not backsliding. This is just grief. It does not mean you aren't healing. It means you are human, and healing is not a straight line, and that's all right. Pay attention. Whatever you have access to, a garden, a window, a walk, a book, a piece of music, pay attention to it. Really pay attention. Not as distraction, but as presence. Stay in the world. The world is still offering itself. The light is still coming through the window. The coffee still smells richer than it has a right to. The world is still worth looking at, even from inside the grief. Especially from inside the grief. And finally, and this is the thing that took me the longest to learn, that I am still, at 70, still learning. Do not make a monument of your grief. Grief is not something to be preserved. It is not a memorial. The person you lost was not their absence. The person you lost was their presence. Everything specific and warm and particular about them. Honor them with presence, not with absence. Honor them by staying in the world, by being moved by beautiful things, by laughing when something is funny, by tending the garden, by reading aloud, by paying attention. That is what James asked of me. That is what I am asking of you. So what is closure? I have thought about this word for 19 years now, and I want to tell you what I actually believe. Closure is not the end of grief. It is not a door shut. It is not the moment you stop feeling the loss. Closure, and I'm going to be careful here because I want to be accurate. Closure is the moment you stop being at war with the loss. In the early years of grief, there is often a quality of resistance, of fighting what happened, not denial exactly. You know what happened. You are not pretending it didn't happen, but a fundamental opposition to the new reality, a sense that this is wrong, this is not how it should be, this should not have happened. I refuse the terms of this. That resistance is understandable and even necessary, up to a point. It is part of the fight to honor what you lost. It is a form of loyalty. I will not accept this easily because what I lost was not an easy thing to lose. But at some point, and this point is different for every person, and I will not tell you when it should come for you. At some point, the resistance starts to cost more than it gives. The refusal of the new reality starts to keep you from the new reality. The energy spent on fighting what becomes energy unavailable for what is. And closure, what I understand closure to be, is the moment you stop fighting. Not because you have stopped loving, not because you have forgotten, not because the grief has ended, but because you have found a way to carry what happened without being at war with it. You have found a way to love what was lost and still move toward what is. I think I found that, or began to find it, on the cliff top in Scotland, on the cliff top in the rain, with the grey sea below me and James beside me, and the understanding settling into my bones slowly, that it was not possible to have had what I had without losing it, and that the losing of it was part of it, that you cannot love as fully as I loved and not be ruined by the ending, and that the ruining is also, as strange as this sounds, also part of the gift, because I was ruined by love, beautifully, completely, gratefully ruined, by 31 years of a man who hummed without knowing he was humming, and who wrote poems about salmon, and who held my hand under the table in the oncologist's office, and who, even in dying, tried to make sure I would keep going. I would not exchange any of it, not the 31 years, and not the grief, not the garden in January mud, and not the yellow legal pads, and not the hospice rooms, and not even the terrible Tuesdays. All of it together is my life. All of it together is who I am. And that acceptance, that incorporation, that saying yes to the whole of it, I think that is the closest I can come to telling you what closure is. Not a door shut, a door opened, I want to tell you about this morning. This morning, I woke up at 6, which is when I always wake up now, because the body develops its insistences as it ages. I made tea. I stood at the kitchen window while the kettle boiled, and I looked at the garden in the November dark. The roses are pruned back for winter. The beds are mulched. There is nothing much to see in the November garden, but I have learned to look at it anyway, to see the dormancy as a kind of fullness, everything waiting, everything potential. I sat down at the kitchen table with my tea. I thought about James. I think about him every morning. That is not a sad thing anymore. It is just true. I thought about the salmon poem. I thought about the kitchen light. I thought about the 2 coffee cups. And then I thought about something else. I thought about what I might do today, what I wanted to do, what would make the day good. I thought, I want to write. I want to call Claire. I want to spend an hour in the garden, even in November, even with nothing much to see. I want to read something that is worth reading. I want to have a cup of tea with Vera at some point, because she is funny and perceptive, and she makes me see things differently, which is a quality I value greatly in a person. I want to be alive, which is not a given and never was, and which is what grief, finally, taught me to understand. I am 70 years old. I have been a wife and a mother, and a librarian, and a gardener, and a hospice volunteer, and a writer of a history no one outside of Oregon has read. I have been a widow for 19 years. I have held the hands of dying strangers and crying daughters and old friends with too much wine and not enough sleep. I have pruned roses in February mud. I have cried in the grocery store. I have laughed until I couldn't breathe at things that wouldn't be funny to anyone else. I have read 12 yellow legal pads of poems in a room that still smelled, faintly, of the man who wrote them. I have not found closure in the sense that the word promises. The grief is still here. James is still gone, and that is still wrong, and it will always be wrong in the way that the truest losses are wrong. Not in a way that demands correction, but in a way that acknowledges the size of what was. But I have found something. I have found that the world is still beautiful, that mornings still matter, that love does not require the presence of the beloved to continue being love, that the person you were in the years of being loved is still the person you are in the years of living without. That the salmon comes home, not because it is easy, not because the ocean is gentle, but because it knows the way. I know the way, not all of it, not the parts that are still ahead of me, the parts I haven't walked yet, the parts that are still dark, that I will approach when I get there, and not before. But enough of it, enough to keep walking, to keep tending the garden, to keep reading aloud, to keep paying attention to the light as it comes through the kitchen window on an ordinary Tuesday morning, when everything is fine, when everything is beautiful, when the coffee smells rich and the rain is on the glass, and you are exactly where you are supposed to be. thank you for listening. I hope, wherever you are, that you are carrying what you carry with a little more ease today than yesterday. I hope you have found, or are finding, your undefended room. I hope someone has sat with you in the hard place, and I hope this is the deepest hope. I hope that at some point, maybe not today, maybe not this year, but at some point, you look at the light coming through your own window and you think, I am still here, and that is enough, and it is enough. It is.